guys, so today I'm going to be talking to you about controlling images, or better known as stereotypes, that are generally associated with black women, in particular focusing on the ideas of like the ghetto or ratchet woman. So first, we're going to start with the controlling image of the Jezebel and the idea that black women are often seen or interpreted or said to be like sexually promiscuous or sexually available is what people tend to think about black women. Like, we don't have enough poise or control over our sexualities to be able to say no. It's basically like anybody and everybody is welcome to the party, to the show, and in reality that's often not really the case. And so I just gonna go through a little short herstory of kind of trying to understand the image of the Jezebel and like what the implications of that are for black women, especially in contemporary society. But first we're gonna go through the like legacy of slavery and how that history shapes the way we think about black female sexuality. So that being said, the idea of the Jezebel or the sexually promiscuous black woman comes directly out of slavery. If you read some of the old slave narratives, it'll oftentimes tell you that in reality, black women didn't really have control over their sexual beings or their sense of self because they were obviously not considered human beings. They were considered property. And so with those laws saying that we weren't considered human beings, we obviously had no rights to our own bodies or our own sexualities, and we couldn't make that argument, especially in any kind of court or anything like that. And so when it comes to the idea of the ratchet woman, that Jezebel stereotype stemming from slavery was a way in which white male masters, slave owners, could in some ways justify their the sexual violence that they often inflicted upon black women and black women's bodies, especially when it came to producing more slave children for them to have more workers in the field or likely in the home, because oftentimes if they're going to be mixed babies, they're going to be lighter skinned, and then and then of course, like, that is a stratified system of colorism that existed in slavery and still exists today, where the light-skinned light-skinned slaves were often the house slaves because they were deemed to be more attractive, more beautiful, more pleasant to the eye for any kind of incoming white guests, especially those that had like a prestigious standing in their communities or wherever they lived. And then the darker skinned slaves were obviously outside in the fields, doing the more difficult labor, or more high intensity labor, and often got harsher punishments as well and less fair treatment, especially by white women. Don't assume that this is just white men. This is oftentimes like white women reinforcing their own femininity by excluding or distancing or utilizing the what we sociologists call the us-they dichotomy of we are one group, you are othered or another group, and so it's us and then them. And with that dichotomy, it helped to define white femininity by using it as like arguing that it was a direct antithesis or opposite of black femininity, because we weren't considered feminine, we weren't considered humans, and so we had no sexual agency or no control over our own bodies. And that said, that's how, through slavery, through rape and sexual violence against the black female body, we get this idea today and since then, essentially, that black women are, slutty, essentially, or sexually promiscuous, or open for business, is kind of a quotation that somebody might make a comment about. And so that whole idea of the black female body being sexually open for business is a lot of reasons why there's so many black women who experience sexual violence, and not just from white men, but from people of all across the board in terms of race, and even class standings. That's not something to be taken lightly. a lot of times, obviously, we know that rape especially prevalent on college campuses, and college campuses are an extremely classed and privileged space. So it's important to keep in mind that rape is not just taking place in poor communities, that this happens all the time to people from all different kinds of class backgrounds, but in particular when centralizing the experiences of black women, today we see images that project that idea and are especially reinforced in like contemporary mainstream hip hop that's like highly commercialized since about the 2000s, or the year 2000, and there's actually been a strong push by white CEOs and owners and runners of mainstream music companies, in particular those around hip hop. That's obviously a black started form of art and music that came out of our understanding or sympathizing or solidarity with our collective diasporic struggle, but that's been co-opted and commodified by white society and white America in particular, to in many ways reinforce ideas about the deviance of blackness in general, but in particular around the deviance and sexual promiscuity of the black female body. And so those images, while glorified in mainstream hip-hop, also serve to teach young generations that those kinds of behaviors and those kinds of exploitative ideas about male ownership and dominance and aggression over the female body, in particular the black female body, are becoming more and more normalized. And it's obviously highly problematic, especially because young people who don't necessarily have the best access to music, who might be able to listen to the radio, are going to be getting these messages on a constant loop, same 10 songs over and over and over, that are reinforcing hypersexuality and the hypersexualization of the female body, in particular black bodies, as well as men. And so the idea that the Jezebel controlling image or stereotype of the sexually promiscuous black woman, it's important to recognize that those roots in slavery and how those can negatively impact us today as well. And so those ideas, when implanted in a young generation, in some ways I feel like will manifest itself in sexual violence against more black women, and that's often seen through like examples of like sex tourism. I mean, personally, I've seen examples of sex tourism that were the underlying assumption was that the sexual prostitutes that made themselves available for often rich white tourist men were black women or other women of color. And speaking from personal experience, seeing young black children selling their bodies on the streets in South America, it's been relatively difficult to try to cope with that, but it's also really important, and that's why it becomes so important to recognize how that comes from slavery and how that might impact a like entire global ideas about black femininity and what's appropriate and not appropriate, and who's rapeable and who has agency or sexual agency or any control over their body. And through that context, I think it's really important that you guys just get that understanding and get that knowledge and get a little bit of that herstory of the experiences of black women and how that has impacted policy decisions. So think about today. Why is it that in Texas, the majority of poor, low-income people of color communities have such limited access to like reproductive health clinics, abortions, etc., whereas, you know, rich hoity-toity white neighborhoods easily can go and get an abortion, you know, and not have to worry about it or worry about where it's going to be or if it's going to be too hard to access, because at the end of the day, that's really that's there for them. And so if you're a poor black woman who maybe perhaps was raped or experienced some kind of sexual violence that resulted in pregnancy, and maybe you don't want to choose to keep said child or fetus, then it becomes increasingly difficult for you to find access to those spaces, which then has implications of pushing black women to either have children that they don't want to have, and then thereby become dependent on the state to help in financially securing the future of that child, like through welfare, Medicaid, food stamps, etc. Versus, or the other option is that it oftentimes leads black women to choose really unsafe, unhealthy ways of going about terminating pregnancy because it's so difficult to get access elsewhere. And so people tend to think, oh, the Jezebel, whatever, the stereotype isn't really that big of a deal. But at the end of the day, when you think about it, these implications have a lot of impacts on the policy that's getting made. These stereotypes really, really heavily impact what white politicians in power think about black women, and that deviance or the deviance of our bodies associated with hypersexuality tends to be a justification for state-sanctioned violence that in many ways leads us to have like health problems, emotional problems, and psychological trauma, things like that. And so it's really important, I thought, to just mention how that legacy of slavery and that idea about black female hypersexuality impacts us every single day. No matter where we are, somebody is going to always be assuming that we are in some ways sexually or otherwise deviant, just based on our racial identification or how they interpolate our identities. And so that's part one.